I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington.
Travis Wayne Goodsell, the vote is going on.
Ms. Collins, guilty.
Oh, Susan Collins voted for him as guilty. Wow.
Mr. Coons, guilty.
We're about to come up on Crapo, Mormon from Idaho.
Mr. Cornyn, not guilty.
We need 17 Republicans.
Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer, not guilty.
God.
Mr. Crapo,
Here it is.
Mr. Crapo, not guilty.
Ah, I betrayed Joseph Smith and Mormonism.
Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines, not
So
guilty.
Lee is coming up next.
Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty.
A vote for not guilty is insurrection.
Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham, not guilty.
Yeah, I thought he was playing with us.
Mr. Grassley,
Oh, God.
not guilty. Mr. Haggerty, not guilty.
We're not going to do it.
Ms. Hassan,
America, as prophesied by Benson, the Constitution will not be saved in
not
Washington.
guilty. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Mr. Hickenlooper, guilty.
It's just becoming
Ms. Hirono,
it's just
guilty.
becoming a party line thing.
Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde Smith, not guilty.
God.
Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson,
The white supremacists are going to rise up in celebration for this.
Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kelly, guilty. Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee,
Yep.
not guilty.
Following in the footsteps of his ancestor, John D. Lee.
Mr. Irfan, guilty. Ms. Lummis, not guilty. Mr.
So
Manchin,
Romney is going to be the only one that
Mr. Manchin,
calls him guilty then.
guilty. Mr. Markey,
Romney will then be a targeted person.
Mr. Marshall, not guilty. Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Mr. Menendez,
Moscow cocaine Mitch.
guilty. Mr. Merkley,
This is a sad day in our nation.
Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms.
Very
Murkowski,
sad day.
Ms. Murkowski, guilty. Mr.
Oh,
Murphy,
at least two that I noticed
guilty.
flipped.
Mrs. Murray, guilty.
We're still 15 away,
Mr. Ossoff,
and we're in the O's.
Mr. Padilla, guilty. Mr. Paul, Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, guilty.
Portman was the one who
Mr. Risch.
fought with Romney.
Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney,
Guilty.
guilty. Ms.
A
Rosen.
little too late.
Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass.
The Kingmen have taken over America.
Mr.
America
Schatz,
has fallen.
guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty.
We are now going to see an uprising of white supremacists.
Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr.
But at least we'll
Shelby,
get our
not guilty. Ms. Sinema,
1400 by the end of the month, I
Ms.
guess.
Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey.
The Republican Party of the inverted pentagram has
Mr.
taken over
Tuberville,
America.
not guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, guilty. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker.
Are we going to make it to
Mr.
60?
Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, not guilty.
Nope. 57 to 43. God. There it is, the death of America. And 2 out of the 3 Mormons were part of the overthrow.